You think you know everything, don't you? Lieutenant Mark Harris muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing as he stared at the old veteran standing in front of him. The veteran's faded tattoo on his arm caught the sunlight, its meaning obscured by years of wear and tear. Harris stood tall, his uniform perfectly pressed, every detail sharp, but his confidence felt misplaced, as he sneered at the ink that decorated the old man's skin. What is that supposed to mean? Some sort of relic from another time? He laughed, but it was more to convince himself than anyone else. Around him, the other recruits chuckled, enjoying the moment, the audacity of the young officer mocking a man old enough to be their father. But the veteran said nothing, his face unchanged, his eyes fixed ahead, as if the world around him didn't exist. His calmness only irritated Harris more. He couldn't understand it. This man, standing so silently, seemed to carry more weight than he could ever imagine. The old man's tattoo, however, was a mystery to him, something irrelevant, a symbol of something forgotten. Harris's arrogance burned brighter as he leaned forward, pointing at the tattoo, his voice louder now. It's pathetic, honestly. No place for that in this day and age. The recruits behind him snickered, but the laughter was shallow, soon fading into uneasy glances as they waited for the veteran's response, which, to their surprise, never came. The moment stretched, the tension growing thicker with every second that passed. The veteran stood still, his posture rigid, the type of stillness that only years of experience could cultivate. His eyes, pale and steady, scanned the crowd of recruits but never stopped on any one of them. Finally, just as Harris was about to speak again, a deep voice interrupted. "Lieutenant Harris," it said, and the sudden change in the air was palpable. The commanding officer, Colonel Robert Thomas, walked slowly into the clearing, his presence immediately silencing the recruits. Harris straightened instinctively, his youthful arrogance replaced by a moment of uncertainty. The colonel stopped next to Harris, his eyes never leaving the veteran. The silence that followed was thick with expectation. "What's the issue here?" the colonel asked, his voice low and controlled. Harris hesitated, caught between defending his stance and the discomfort now creeping into his mind. He opened his mouth to speak but paused, the words suddenly feeling inadequate. Colonel Thomas turned his attention to the old veteran's tattoo, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. For a split second, the room felt as though it held its breath, waiting for the colonel's next move. Then, in the quietest of tones, he spoke again. "That tattoo is not just any mark, Lieutenant." His gaze shifted from the veteran to Harris, locking eyes with a quiet intensity that made Harris shrink back ever so slightly. "That tattoo tells a story that you have yet to hear." The recruits, still silent, could feel the shift. It was as if the entire base had just been subtly reminded of something greater than their training, greater than the hierarchy, something deeper that had not been understood before. Harris stood frozen, his earlier mockery replaced by a growing unease. The colonel's words resonated, and suddenly, the veteran's tattoo no longer seemed like a meaningless relic, but something far more important than Harris had ever realized. Harris opened his mouth to argue, but the colonel's next words stopped him cold. "It's time you learned something, Lieutenant. And it's not in your manuals." The colonel's words were firm, but not harsh. They carried the weight of a truth that had eluded Harris up until now. The old veteran's tattoo, something so simple in its appearance, was now a symbol of something far more profound than the young officer could have ever anticipated. Lieutenant Harris stood frozen, his previous words hanging in the air like a forgotten challenge, as Colonel Robert Thomas fixed his gaze on the old veteran. The recruits around them stood motionless, the tension in the yard so thick it was almost tangible. Harris could feel his pulse quicken as the silence stretched on, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. The colonel's voice broke through the quiet, steady and calm. "That tattoo represents something far beyond what you understand, Lieutenant." Harris swallowed hard, his mind racing to grasp the sudden shift in the conversation, but it felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, and he was no longer sure where he stood. The veteran, still unmoved and calm, shifted slightly, his weathered face betraying nothing. The tattoo, a faded image of a unit insignia, was no longer just an old relic, it had become a symbol of a history that Harris had never considered. "You think that tattoo is just ink on skin," the colonel continued, his eyes not leaving the veteran, "but it's the story of sacrifice, of battles fought, of friends lost, and the price paid by men like him." Harris's throat tightened as the truth of the colonel's words slowly began to seep into him, but he still couldn't fully understand. He had always seen veterans like the old man as relics of a bygone era, people who had lived through wars that had no relevance to the present. But now, standing in the yard, with the colonel's words hanging in the air, he was starting to realize just how wrong he had been. The recruits around him, once laughing and joking about the veteran, now stood in hushed silence, their eyes shifting from the colonel to the veteran, as the true meaning of respect began to settle in. Harris felt a knot form in his stomach, the discomfort growing as he struggled to reconcile his previous thoughts with the reality now unfolding before him. The colonel turned slightly, glancing at the recruits, his voice lower but still filled with authority. "The problem is not with the tattoo," he said. "The problem is with your understanding of what it represents. You see a symbol, but you don't see the man who earned it." The words stung Harris more than he expected. He had spent so much time believing that respect was earned through rank, through achievement, through the orders they followed. But now, he felt as though the foundation beneath him was crumbling, and all the training, all the structure he had relied on, was being questioned. The veteran remained silent, his face still unreadable, his posture unchanging. It was as though he had already given all he had to give, and now the moment was for others to understand, for others to learn. Harris felt his chest tighten, a mixture of guilt and frustration swirling within him. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words felt inadequate, empty. He looked at the colonel, searching for answers, but the colonel simply nodded toward the veteran, the message clear. It was not for the colonel to explain any further. The lesson, Harris realized, was something he would have to learn on his own, in silence, through reflection. The old veteran's tattoo was no longer just a piece of ink. It was a story, a history, and now, it was a lesson that Harris would carry with him forever, whether he understood it fully or not. And as the colonel turned away, the recruits silently following suit, Harris remained standing, the weight of the veteran's tattoo and its meaning pressing down on him like never before. Lieutenant Harris stood motionless, the weight of Colonel Thomas's words hanging in the air like a thick fog, clouding his thoughts. The base around him, once bustling with the usual noise of soldiers going about their day, had fallen eerily silent. The recruits who had once found amusement in the old veteran's tattoo were now standing at attention, their expression serious, no longer mocking but reflective. Harris felt an unfamiliar pressure building in his chest, a mixture of guilt and frustration, as he struggled to reconcile the image of the old man, once a joke, with the deeper meaning that the colonel had uncovered. The tattoo on the veteran's arm, faded with time but still holding significance, had become a symbol of something much larger than Harris had initially imagined. It represented years of service, battles fought, and a history that Harris, in his youthful arrogance, had failed to see. The realization settled heavily in him, and he found himself staring at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of the veteran or the colonel. The air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second, as though the world was waiting for him to understand something that had been beyond his reach. As the recruits slowly began to disperse, their footsteps quiet on the hard ground, Harris remained in place, still processing the shift that had just occurred. The old veteran had not spoken a word, yet in his silence, he had conveyed more than any lecture or training session could ever do. Harris looked up, watching as the veteran began to walk away, his slow, deliberate steps echoing in the now empty yard. The man moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen more in his lifetime than Harris could comprehend, and yet, there was no boastfulness in his gait, no need to prove anything. He simply walked, carrying the weight of his own experiences with grace and dignity. For a moment, Harris felt a pang of something, regret perhaps, or maybe a longing for a deeper understanding. He had always prided himself on being sharp, on knowing the rules and following them. But now, standing in the wake of the veteran's quiet departure, Harris realized that there was much more to being a soldier than just following orders. There was respect, there was history, and there was a shared bond that transcended rank and position. As the last of the recruits filed out of the yard, Harris remained standing, lost in his thoughts. The colonel's voice broke through the silence once again, gentle but firm. "Respect is earned, Lieutenant. And it is not given lightly." Harris nodded, the words sinking in deeper than he expected. He had always thought of respect as something you earn through accomplishments, through authority, through rank. But now, he understood that it was something far more profound, something that came not just from achievements but from the weight of experience, the sacrifices made, and the stories lived. As he turned to leave, Harris couldn't help but glance back at the spot where the veteran had stood. He had learned something today, something that would stay with him long after the day had ended. He would never look at a soldier, or a tattoo, or a uniform the same way again. As the days passed, Lieutenant Harris found himself reflecting on the events of the previous week, the lessons learned still echoing in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the veteran, the quiet strength in the man's movements, the dignity he carried without a single word. Every time Harris saw a recruit laughing or mocking the old man's tattoo, he was reminded of the shift in his own perspective. The tattoo, once a symbol of something he had not understood, had transformed into a symbol of respect. The base, which had once been filled with the noise of casual banter and jokes at the veteran's expense, had become a place of silent acknowledgement. The recruits, once eager to mock, now stood at attention when the old veteran passed by. Even Harris himself had begun to change. No longer did he see the veteran as an outdated relic of the past, instead, he saw him as a man who had earned his place in history. Harris found himself drawn to the veteran, watching him as he walked through the base, his every step slow and deliberate. It wasn't just the tattoo anymore, it was everything the man represented. There were stories in that tattoo, stories that Harris had yet to fully understand but now felt the need to uncover. One afternoon, as Harris walked to the mess hall, he saw the old veteran standing outside, gazing at the sky, lost in thought. Without really thinking, Harris approached him. "Sir," Harris began, his voice hesitant, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior the other day." The old veteran turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes locking with Harris's. For a moment, Harris wasn't sure what to expect. But the veteran's face remained unchanged, calm and unreadable. "No need for that," the veteran said, his voice low and steady. "You were just young. You'll understand one day." Harris was taken aback by the words. They weren't harsh, but they carried an understanding that cut deeper than any reprimand. The veteran's voice was filled with a quiet wisdom, the kind that only comes from years of life experience. "I've seen things that would make your eyes wide, son," the veteran continued, "things you wouldn't believe, and things you might never have to see. But that tattoo, it's a part of me, just like everything else. It's a story that's mine to carry, and if you ever want to hear it, you'll know when the time is right." Harris stood still for a moment, letting the words sink in. There was something about the way the veteran spoke, so calmly, so sure of himself, that made Harris realize how little he truly knew. "Thank you, sir," Harris said, his voice soft but genuine. The veteran simply nodded, his eyes returning to the sky as if the conversation had ended. Harris watched him for a moment longer before turning and walking away, his thoughts swirling. The words, the tattoo, the stories, it all made sense now. He was beginning to understand, slowly but surely. The respect he felt for the old man grew with each passing day, and though he still had much to learn, Harris knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his journey as a soldier. It was no longer about authority or rank, it was about recognizing the stories that each person carried with them, stories that defined them in ways that went beyond any uniform or badge. The days after the conversation with the old veteran felt different for Lieutenant Harris. The once constant noise of the base, the daily routines, the endless training, all seemed distant now. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and Harris began to see things differently. Every time he passed the veteran in the hallway or saw him sitting quietly in the common room, something about the old man's presence felt heavier, more significant. He still wasn't sure what it was, but he could no longer dismiss it. His mind kept returning to the tattoo, the silent symbol of a past filled with stories that he had yet to understand. The veteran had spoken of his tattoo as if it were a quiet testament to the battles he had fought, the lives he had touched, the pain he had endured. But to Harris, it had always seemed like just a symbol, a piece of ink. Now, however, he felt a nagging curiosity pulling at him. He needed to know more, to hear those stories the veteran had mentioned. But how could he ask? Harris had never been one to seek out others for personal stories, always focused on the mission, always moving forward. But something about the veteran's silence called to him, urged him to learn what lay beneath. One evening, after a long day of training, Harris found himself walking toward the veteran, who was sitting on the same worn bench where they had first spoken. The veteran looked up as Harris approached, his expression unchanged, calm as always. Harris stood in front of him for a moment, unsure how to begin. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "Sir, you mentioned that your tattoo had a story. I think I'm ready to hear it." The old veteran didn't say anything at first. His eyes studied Harris, as if assessing whether the young officer truly understood what he was asking. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the veteran nodded slowly, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're asking for something that's not easily given, Lieutenant," he said, his voice low, steady, but filled with years of experience. "These stories, they don't just belong to me. They belong to the men I served with, to the ones who didn't make it back. But I'll share what I can, if you're ready to listen." Harris nodded, his heart beating a little faster, both nervous and eager. The veteran took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts, and then began. "This tattoo," he said, looking down at his arm, was inked in a small field hospital, halfway around the world. It was late in the war, and we were facing some of the fiercest battles we'd ever fought. We had just lost one of our own, a man I considered a brother. He'd been a part of our team since the beginning, and losing him, it changed everything. This tattoo was our way of remembering him, a way to carry a piece of him with us." Harris listened intently, the weight of the veteran's words settling in. He could feel the gravity of the story, the pain and loss behind the ink. It was no longer just a symbol, it was a tribute, a memorial to a fallen comrade. The veteran's voice softened as he continued. "I don't wear this tattoo for myself," he said quietly. "I wear it for him, and for the others we've lost along the way. We carry their memories with us, even when they can't be here to carry their own." Harris's throat tightened as he processed the words. He had always thought of soldiers as warriors, as people defined by their ability to fight and win. But now, hearing the veteran speak, he understood that being a soldier wasn't just about fighting, it was about the sacrifices made, the bonds formed, and the memories carried forward. The veteran fell silent for a moment, his eyes distant, as if he was reliving those days in his mind. Harris stood there, unsure of what to say, but knowing that the respect he had once lacked for the veteran was now something he could never take back. "Thank you, sir," Harris finally said, his voice barely a whisper. The veteran nodded, a knowing look in his eyes, and for the first time, Harris felt that he truly understood the weight of what it meant to wear that tattoo. Lieutenant Harris woke up early the next morning, the weight of the previous day still heavy on his mind. The conversation with the veteran had left him unsettled, and now, as the sun rose over the base, he couldn't help but replay the words the old man had spoken. The tattoo was no longer just ink on skin, but a testament to sacrifice, to comrades lost, to a history that Harris had been blind to. He had walked into the conversation expecting something trivial, a simple exchange, but instead, he had been given a lesson in humility, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. As he walked to the mess hall, he saw the veteran sitting at his usual spot, the same quiet demeanor, the same steady gaze. For a moment, Harris considered avoiding him, but something inside him urged him forward. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he felt a need to understand more, to know the man who had shared so much with him, even without saying much at all. Harris approached slowly, his footsteps quiet against the concrete floor. As he got closer, the veteran looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Harris's. There was no hostility, no anger, just a calm understanding that Harris couldn't quite place. "Sir," Harris said, his voice uncertain but respectful. The veteran nodded, acknowledging him without speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Harris continued, his words hesitant at first, but gaining confidence as he spoke. "About the tattoo, about the story behind it. I didn't get it before." The veteran's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that almost looked like approval. "You're starting to understand," he said quietly. Harris was taken aback by the simplicity of the statement. He had been expecting a long explanation, but instead, the veteran had just acknowledged the change in him. It was as though the weight of the lesson was something that Harris had to carry on his own, something that couldn't be fully explained. The veteran looked down at his tattoo, his fingers grazing over the faded ink as if recalling something long past. "It's not just about the battles, Lieutenant," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's about the people you lose along the way. The men who never get the chance to tell their own stories. This tattoo, this memory, it's for them as much as it is for me." Harris nodded, the words settling deep within him. He had always thought of soldiers as warriors, as machines trained to fight and win. But now, he saw them differently. They were more than just fighters. They were carriers of stories, of histories that couldn't be captured in medals or accolades. The veteran's life, his past, had shaped him into the man he was now, and it was a life that Harris now saw as something far more important than he had ever realized. "I want to learn more," Harris said, his voice steady now. "I want to hear those stories." The veteran met his gaze once again, his expression unreadable but his eyes soft. "In time, Lieutenant," he replied. "In time, you'll hear them all." Harris stood there for a moment longer, his mind racing with the weight of what had just been said. He didn't know if he would ever fully understand, but he knew now that it was something worth striving for. As he turned to leave, Harris felt a shift inside him. The journey wasn't over, but he had taken the first step, and that, in itself, was enough. The veteran's words, the tattoo, the stories, everything had changed for Harris. And for the first time, he felt ready to truly listen. The days after their conversation passed in a blur, and Lieutenant Harris couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. The old veteran's words, the tattoo, and the stories they represented had begun to settle deep within him. Harris had always thought of himself as someone who understood respect, someone who could command a room and inspire those around him. But now, for the first time, he realized that true respect wasn't about power or authority, it was about understanding, about acknowledging the stories that shaped those around him. As the days went on, Harris found himself seeking out the veteran more often. Every chance he had, he would approach him, trying to learn more about the past, trying to hear those stories. But the veteran never offered them freely. Instead, he would simply nod, his eyes filled with quiet knowing, as if waiting for Harris to truly ask the right questions. One evening, as the sun was setting over the base, Harris found himself sitting beside the veteran on that same worn bench. The air was still, the sounds of the base quieting as the day came to an end. Harris turned to the veteran, his voice hesitant but filled with determination. "Sir," he began, "I know I've asked a lot already, but I think I'm ready to hear more. About the tattoo, about the men you lost." The old veteran didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked out at the horizon, his eyes distant. For a moment, Harris wasn't sure if the veteran would speak at all. But then, the veteran shifted, his eyes softening as he turned toward Harris. "You've come a long way, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "But it's not something you can rush. The stories come when they're meant to." When you're ready, you'll know. Harris nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He had hoped for a detailed account, a recounting of battles and sacrifices. Instead, he was left with the quiet certainty that there was something deeper to the veteran's silence, something that spoke more powerfully than any story could. The veteran's tattoo, once a mere mark of ink, had become a symbol of resilience, of a lifetime lived with purpose. Harris found himself yearning to understand it fully, to grasp the weight of those memories. Over time, the young officer found himself changing. His interactions with the recruits became less about asserting his authority and more about listening. He began to see them as individuals, each carrying their own stories, their own histories. He started to appreciate the quiet moments, the ones that didn't require words to communicate respect. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Harris stood outside the barracks, watching the recruits training. His gaze drifted to the old veteran, who was sitting on a bench nearby, watching them too. Harris walked over and sat down beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was filled with understanding, with mutual respect that had been built over time. Finally, Harris spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I'm starting to get it now," he said. "The tattoo, the stories. It's all part of something bigger than just us." The veteran turned to him, his face softening. "You're getting there, Lieutenant," he said. "Just remember, it's not about the tattoo or the stories. It's about what you do with what you've learned. It's about the respect you give and the respect you earn." Harris sat there in silence, his thoughts swirling. For the first time, he truly understood the value of the lessons he had been taught. It wasn't about rank or authority, it was about humility, about listening, and about understanding that everyone, no matter their past, had a story to tell. As the evening wore on, Harris sat beside the veteran, the two men sharing a quiet moment of understanding. The bond between them had been formed, not through words or grand gestures, but through a shared silence, through the respect that had grown in the space between them. The veteran's tattoo, once a symbol of something he didn't understand, had become a symbol of the lessons he had learned, lessons that would stay with him long after the day had ended. As the weeks passed, Lieutenant Harris found himself reflecting more and more on the lessons he had learned from the old veteran. The once clear divide between the younger, more modern soldiers and the older veterans had started to blur. The tattoo that had once seemed like a mere decoration now symbolized so much more. Harris began to see the world through a different lens, one that valued experience and the untold stories of those who had lived through the trials of war. His interactions with the recruits changed as well. Instead of merely issuing orders and maintaining strict discipline, Harris found himself taking the time to listen to them, to understand their fears, their ambitions, and their struggles. He started sharing the lessons he had learned from the veteran, albeit in his own way, helping the younger soldiers see that there was more to being a soldier than just following orders. One afternoon, as Harris walked through the base, he spotted the veteran sitting on the same bench where they had shared so many quiet moments. The old man was staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Without thinking, Harris walked over and sat down beside him, the air between them comfortable and unspoken. "You were right," Harris said, his voice soft but sincere. The veteran didn't respond at first, but Harris could tell he was listening. "I never really understood what that tattoo meant," he continued. "But now, I get it. It's not just about the battles you fought. It's about everything you carry with you, all the memories, all the sacrifices." The veteran finally turned to him, his expression unreadable but his eyes warm with quiet approval. "It's not something you can teach, Lieutenant," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's something you have to learn for yourself, through your own experiences. You're starting to understand that now." Harris nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It was as if a weight had been lifted, as though he had unlocked a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve, to lead, and to be a part of something much bigger than himself. The old veteran's quiet wisdom had become a guiding light for him, one that illuminated a path he had never seen before. Over time, Harris began to see the recruits in a different light. He no longer viewed them as just soldiers under his command but as individuals with their own stories, their own reasons for being there. He made an effort to connect with each one, to understand their motivations, their struggles, and their dreams. It was through these conversations that Harris realized how much he still had to learn, not just as a leader, but as a person. One day, while on a routine patrol, Harris found himself walking alongside a group of recruits. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the base. As they walked, one of the recruits asked him a question, a simple one about the tattoo. "Sir," the recruit asked, "what's the story behind that tattoo?" For a moment, Harris was silent, the weight of the question settling on him. He had never fully shared the story with anyone before, but now, standing in front of these young men and women, he realized that the time had come. He looked at the recruit, then at the others who had gathered around, all of them eager to listen. "It's a story about respect," Harris began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "A story about learning to honor those who came before you, about carrying their memories with you, even when they're no longer around. It's a symbol of everything we fight for, everything we stand for." The recruits listened intently, their faces reflecting the gravity of the words. Harris could see the change in their eyes, the respect that had been earned, not through medals or rank, but through understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group continued their walk in silence, the bonds between them growing stronger with each step. Harris knew that he still had much to learn, but he was no longer the same man who had once mocked the tattoo. He was now a leader who understood the true meaning of respect, of sacrifice, and of the unspoken stories that shaped every soldier's journey. And for the first time, he felt ready to carry that weight. To honor the legacy of those who had come before him. Lieutenant Harris walked through the base, his boots echoing on the pavement, but this time, the sound felt different. The world around him seemed to have slowed down, the weight of the past few weeks pressing on his shoulders. His mind constantly returned to the old veteran, to the lessons he had learned, and to the tattoo that had changed everything. He had spent so much time focused on being the best, on following the rules and rising through the ranks, but now he realized that there was more to being a soldier than just strategy and discipline. Respect. That was the key. Respect for the past, for the sacrifices made, for the stories carried by every soldier, whether they spoke them or not. The veteran's words had shaken him to his core, and now, Harris could not look at the world the same way. The recruits, once just faces in a crowd, now had names, personalities, and histories. They all had something to offer, something to teach, and it was Harris's job to listen, to understand, and to guide them. He wasn't just their superior, he was their mentor. He had to be someone they could learn from, someone who could help them grow. But it wasn't just about being a leader. It was about being a man who understood the value of empathy, of seeing the humanity in others. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, Harris found himself standing outside, looking across the base. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Lieutenant." Harris turned to find the old veteran walking towards him, his pace steady, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Sir," Harris greeted, straightening up, instinctively standing at attention. The veteran stopped a few feet away, his gaze lingering on Harris for a moment before he spoke. "You've changed," he said simply. Harris wasn't sure how to respond. The change was subtle, but it was there. He felt it, and he could see it in the way his interactions with the recruits had shifted. "I've been thinking about what you said," Harris replied, his voice steady. "I understand now. It's not just about following orders, about being the best. It's about something deeper, something that's earned through time, through experience. It's about the stories we carry, the ones we don't always speak, but the ones that shape us." The veteran nodded, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Good," he said. "You're starting to get it." Harris felt a sense of pride, not from the words themselves, but from the knowledge that he was finally on the right path. It wasn't an easy path, and it would take time, but for the first time, he felt like he was headed in the right direction. "I want to do better," Harris said, his voice filled with determination. "For the men I lead. For the ones who came before me." The veteran's gaze softened. "You already are, Lieutenant. Keep walking the path, and you'll see the change, in yourself and in those around you." As the veteran turned and walked away, Harris stood still, watching him disappear into the distance. The weight of the conversation settled in, and for the first time, Harris truly understood the meaning of leadership. It wasn't about power or control, it was about understanding, respect, and the willingness to learn. He was ready to face whatever came next, not just as a soldier, but as a man who had learned the most important lesson of all. The true meaning of sacrifice and the power of respect could never be taught through rank or titles, it had to be lived, and it had to be earned.